G'day and welcome to the Grow a Small Business Podcast. I'm your host, Troy Truen. Each week, we speak with an owner who has grown a business with 5 to 30 team members to something bigger. Diving into their numbers and unearthing the pain they've experienced, we explore what they did to overcome each barrier and what they would do differently from day one. Let's get into it.
Welcome, everyone. Today I'm interviewing Ted McKenna, who is based in Illinois near Chicago in the United States. So thanks for your time, Ted.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Now, Ted's a co-author with Matthew Dixon of a great book called The JOLT Effect, which is about how high performers can overcome customer indecision and certainly grow a small business. We love it. We certainly reference it on many occasions, even in a podcast yesterday with a business owner. So I'm looking forward to this chat, Ted. And you've got an upcoming book called The Activator Advantage, I believe.
Yeah, that's right. So, we study high-performing salespeople and try to understand how they're evolving with buyers over time. And most recently, a large-scale study of professional services salespeople. So lawyers, accountants, bankers, consultants, who have to sell for their job, but they, of course, have their day job of being a lawyer, a banker, accountant, or consultant. And so that study kind of looked into what do the best doer sellers do as a way to drive business development and sell. So that's what that book will be about.
Yeah, no, great. And I guess like the JOLT Effect, it was actually on the back of research you did with over a couple of million sales conversations, I believe. Is that right?
2.5 million. Yeah. So it was, so we worked at the time for a company that specializes in conversation intelligence. So for your listeners, they might be familiar with call platforms like a Gong or a Chorus or things like that. And so we were studying conversations on, from a seller and a buyer and the interchange and exchange. Now, it just so happened we started that right at the beginning of the global pandemic. We started the study right around then. And that wasn't coincidental because we had access to way more calls than we ever would have from all sorts of different, especially more complex type conversations, because those used to happen in coffee shops or customers' offices, around the world. And all of a sudden we're happening on Zoom or Teams or other places where we could record and understand that at scale. So and totally ended up studying 2.5 million sales conversations. And that has challenges of its own. So we ran a predictive model as a way to understand out of all the stuff that you could find in those conversations, what actually mattered most. But large scale study done a couple of years ago.
Yeah, awesome. So it's obviously just not your and Matt's opinion, so some research to back it up. So, which is a good segue. So today we're going to chat about buyer indecision and how you can overcome this. And I think there's some fascinating things that come out of your studies in the book we can chat about. So just to, before we kick things off, just give our audience a little bit of a background about yourself and your experience on this topic.
My background. So I'm a researcher by trade. I study high-performing salespeople and buyers and customers alike. So what are the things that make customers happy and sad? And I've done that for most of my career. I grew up at a company called CEB, which is now part of Gartner. So research-based organization studying commercial leaders and their teams and what have you. Early in my days there, we did this landmark piece of research that ultimately became a book called The Challenger Sale, which some of your audience members might know, and a well-known book in that space. So it was on those research teams and then helping lots of sales organizations and senior leaders take action on those findings. How do we build more challengers, create more of a challenger organization? Did a little stint in professional services, trying to implement some of those things on sort of the sales enablement and content marketing side of things. And then Matt and I worked at Tether, which is that conversation intelligence company. So we were building algorithms and scores and doing research on conversation intelligence data, which is a very rich data set, different than the structured data sets that we were used to working with, surveys and qualitative interviews and things like that. So got some new experience with unstructured data sets. And the book, we launched a new business as well. So now our business works with sales organizations, commercial organizations as a way to take action on some of the things we're finding in research that sellers can do to perform better and replicate high performer behaviors.
So, Ted, in today's sort of rapidly changing market, what do you think are the sort of the main drivers of buyer indecision, and particularly for small business owners sort of trying to sell to customers?
Yeah, so it's to your point earlier. It's not so much my opinion, but rather what does the evidence show? Is both the secular increase of indecision with buyers, and then what are the sort of underpinnings of it? Because we do see indecision on the rise for buyers. In our study, we found 87% of sales opportunities have either high or moderate levels of indecision. So whether the buyer is admitting it or not, whether they're even aware of it or not, it is affecting their decision calculus and manifests in stalled decisions or hesitation or cold feet or backtracking, lots of different ways that it shows up. But it's on the rise. When you look at the evidence as to what's happening here, some of the biggest drivers of indecision are also the same reason why it's increasing in nature. So specifically there's a whole series of things that make people more or less indecisive, based on your personality and how you evaluate information, how you compare alternatives and things like that. That was true 50 years ago, and that will be true, 50 years from now. There are some contributing factors, I think, in terms of how people consume information and research information online that I think has maybe exacerbated some of those psychological drivers of indecision. But in the context of a purchase, when you go to buy something, especially for a B2B buyer who's buying from some other business, there are three big fears that pop up as part of that purchase. And the first one is options overload. So even after they decide they want to buy from you and your business, they still look at what they see as a sea of options and choices that they have to make decisions about. Contract length and onboarding times and information, integrations, data migration. Of course, this will differ a little bit based on what you're selling, but every buyer has some amount of decisions and they all kind of look right. And so for them, they kind of struggle to make trade-offs. That's on the rise because what business out there is giving their buyers less choice and less options? If anything, we're doing the opposite. We're trying to give them as many options as possible and try to be as flexible as we possibly can. So that's on the rise. The second big reason is information overload. So they feel like, hey, there's so much information out there that it's my job to make sure I know it all before I make a decision, such that I don't then look like a fool or look like an idiot after I made the decision and new information comes to light that I should have been aware of. That's, of course, on the rise because the amount of information is also on the rise, right? Like there's the internet exists and more channels of research, third-party analysts, Gen AI, all sorts of ways in which buyers have access to more information these days than ever before. And the third big reason that buyers get stalled in those situations is what we call expectations overload, where they feel like, their expectations for achieving these outcomes still remain far too uncertain. Too many variables and dependencies, too many things that could go wrong. And they're worried that when it goes wrong, they're going to get blamed for it having gone wrong. And the reason that's on a secular rise is because most businesses today try to drive urgency and create some amount of a burning platform for their buyers to change by making that change feel very big and very urgent, very transformative in nature. And they use that to catch people's attention and to drive urgency and need. And it's successful in doing so. But of course, there's a flip side to that, which is that also introduces all sorts of dependencies and variables and thorns that buyer is going to have to work through at some point. And so it contributes more and more to that indecision.
Yeah, that's quite fascinating, sort of the psychological background to it, right? So in a small business environment, and buyer indecision, what are the are there any long-term risks that it poses for I guess, small business owners that in not understanding this concept?
Well, certainly, I mean, look, I'm a small business owner myself, right? And so time is very scarce, right? For companies where, you're trying to grow faster, maybe than you have resources available to take that on. And so, time constrained world, we can scarcely afford to waste time on opportunities that don't have a likelihood of coming to a close, right? One of the interesting but difficult things about indecision is that it's often hidden beneath the surface. The buyer doesn't just come out and tell us we stink at making decisions, right? Or that I'm highly indecisive. They might not even be aware of it, that it's happening. And yet we know the research will tell us it's lurking there, underneath the waterline, if you will. And even worse, actually, it's often hidden in plain sight because the buyer says really positive things like, this is great and this is amazing. And we are deceived into thinking because this thing is great or because they have interest in all these different options, that will equate to a decision. And so we confuse interest and desire with the degree to which this person will ever come to a decision. And so the first thing that comes to mind as a small business owner is, gosh, it would be great if I had a better lens on who's a real buyer and who's not. Which decisions are stalling out, and how can I use that to understand where I should prioritize my time and my team's time?
Yeah, that's a good point. As you say, time is valuable in small business land and in any, I guess, business. So, having the ability to prioritise opportunities is very important.
Do you need a guide on how to build your own money printing marketing machine? Do you feel like marketing is a mysterious art, only cracked by a chosen few? Fear not, we get it. Mastering marketing can be like taming a dragon. Download a copy of the Marketing Funding Flywheel ebook, which has 41 pages packed with over 50 tools and tips for your business. Let's get into it. Head to growsmallbusiness.com. We have plenty of resources waiting for you in the footer of our website.
So, Ted, in the JOLT Effect, you discuss sort of 4 key behaviours to overcome prior indecision. So, could you sort of unpack those 4 key behaviours for us?
Yeah. So the JOLT playbook is sort of meant to help a buyer overcome what psychologists would call a fear of messing up. Well, I guess actually that's a term that we came up with. So most people are familiar with the fear of missing out, right? That we try to drive a FOMO for buyers, and that's a really useful tactic to drive desire, to drive need and urgency. And there's psychology that's the reason why that's successful is rooted in psychology. There's what psychologists would call loss aversion, or specifically an error of omission, right? The buyer is feeling as if they're going to miss out if they don't take action. And so we use different techniques as a way to do that. Up is quite almost the opposite, which is rooted in what psychologists will call the error of commission, which is I have done something or I will do something and it goes wrong, I'll get blamed. And so that creates hesitation. So the indecision is very much rooted in that area. So the fear of messing up becomes the thing I need to solve for. Now, one small aside before we get to the JOLT playbook is one big part of the study is that we often found that sellers or business owners, if they are acting as sellers as well, are mistreating those hesitations or those stalls. We assume that when that buyer stalls out or when they hesitate, it's rooted in the fact that they haven't been persuaded enough, that they don't want it enough. And so we go back to that FOMO play and try to relitigate the case for change. And what we found actually is that backfires. It makes things worse, not better, because that buyer is already fearful. It's just, and now we throw more fear on top of it. Well, but all the bad things will happen if you don't move forward. So that's the first most important lesson with the JOLT playbook is don't do more damage. Don't mishandle that moment that the buyer stalls out, not because they don't want to change, but rather they fear that if they were to change, it's going to mess up and they'll get blamed. Now, as you go to then help them overcome indecision, that's what the JOLT playbook is, JOLT. It happens to be an acronym. So it stands for the 4 key behaviors. And we found that high performers do differently than their peers to overcome indecision. But of course, it also has double meaning. We're trying to jolt a customer past indecision, jolt them into action. So that first one is around judging indecision. And this is what I was referencing a few moments ago about how small businesses can really, I think, take heed to this, which is that I have to understand the size and depth and breadth of indecision. Partly for selfish reasons, because I need to understand the quality of this opportunity and are they ever going to be able to come to a decision or not? And if not, or not soon, I might reforecast it or think differently about prioritizing my time. But in doing that, of course, I'll learn a little bit about the type of indecision that this buyer might be experiencing. And that then is helpful in terms of where I go next. Because each successive other part of the playbook, the O, the L, and the T, are all aligned to one of those big fears of messing up. So the O is about offering a firm and personal recommendation. And that's particularly powerful for that buyer who's stuck because of options overload. They can't make sense of which direction to move in, which option to select. And so a firm and personal recommendation has the effect of, for that buyer, of kind of sharing in that choice and actually taking on some of the perceived blame that they will have. I share in some of that blame with that recommendation. The L of the story, the limit the exploration, is a skill that's particularly powerful for that buyer who's stuck because they're into analysis paralysis, right? They're stuck because they've information overload. It's not all that rational. They feel like they still have to do more homework, even though they have access to copious amounts of information. So the best sellers there are finding ways to limit exploration to healthy rather than excessive levels. They've got to find ways to demonstrate that they can be trusted along the way, that they have the buyer's best interest in mind, and that they can step into this feeling like an informed purchaser. So there's a couple of tactics involved there. And then finally, the T part of the story is about taking risk off the table for that highly indecisive buyer, right? And this is particularly powerful and necessary for the buyer who's stuck because they feel like outcomes still remain too uncertain, right? They're going to be the one exception. Other people are able to do this, but we might not be able to do this. And so in those situations, we can set proper expectations, and sometimes we may have to offer some sort of safety net, just as a way to kind of take some risk off the table for that buyer.
Yeah, that's some great insights, and I think at the very least, I think small business owners should definitely buy the JOLT Effect and unpack that in more detail through the book. And I'm pretty sure there'll be some good outcomes for them in their business. So I guess, like you mentioned, information overload, and I guess sometimes that can lead to, depending on the circumstances, obviously, distrust and uncertainty, particularly in today's market. So have you got any suggestions how small business owners can build trust and credibility to help reduce that buyer indecision?
Yeah, I mean, there's there's a whole host of things you can do, both like at scale as you think about, how you sort of position your brand and market. But where we study it more is once we start having conversations with that buyer, and the thing in particular that we push leaders and sales teams to keep in mind is that most buyers come in the door distrustful of you as an organization. And so the first lesson is, how do we earn back some of that trust right from the beginning? Understanding that they come in with some distrust. And the reason they're distrustful from the beginning is it's nothing to do actually with the sales organization or with the small business. It's not their fault. It's just the nature of things, right? Buyers are just wired to assume that you're hiding the bad news information and only giving them the good news information, right? That you're, they've been oversold in the past and been overpromised in the past, and they assume that you're probably going to try to do the same thing. And so there's some distrust we have to earn back right at the beginning. Some of this comes down to just signaling that you can be this honest, trustworthy broker, right? That in fact you have their best interest in mind. One easy technique we talk to sellers about, and to this works, I would assume as well for small business owners, is telling the buyer what not to buy, which feels a little bit like, wait, hold on, you think you're trying to sell me as much as possible, but so it's a very trust building thing when you tell me, hey, this might not be right for you, or maybe this is something that you can grow into, but let's start in a different place. Giving credit to other competitors is another potential a way to earn back a little trust. So there's a series of things that you can do, but of course there's also just some of the things that I'm sure a lot of your small business owners are already doing in terms of making sure you're coming across as a genuine, empathetic person in that conversation. And for your listeners, it's probably more of a problem for their team members than it is for them individually. But it's just a good reminder of just how important, it is to demonstrate to that buyer that, you aren't trying to, like, the last thing I want to do is oversell you. The last thing I want to do is overpromise you. I'd rather underpromise and overdeliver is the mindset we want to have going in.
Yeah, that's some good points there. So for many small businesses, their biggest competitor in some ways is buyers deciding to do nothing, which I guess comes back to that fear of mucking up, as you term it. So what advice would you give to help small business owners, I guess, get buyers from that no decision to yes?
Yeah, well, I might steal that, by the way. I think you said fear of mucking up, which is, probably a good Australian way of saying it. No, I love it. So look, like JOLT is a proven pathway, a proven playbook for helping the buyer overcome indecision. I will say that there's value on its own in just understanding more about what's driving indecision and its relative size, because again, time is valuable. And if I redirect my focus onto buyers who are more likely to make a decision, it's that much easier to run that business, if you will, and direct resources. But I think the of those skills that we find, the place we tell people to start usually is making a recommendation, which is interesting because it's not for all the skills in the study. It's probably one of the least newsworthy skills. Like, most people think, sure, I should make a recommendation, but yet when you look at the data, it's actually fascinating. Very few of us do make recommendations, and actually, what you find is the more indecisive the buyer gets, the less likely the seller is to make a recommendation. It's like the more hesitation we sense, the more deferential we become. And so I think that's the thing we have to overcome, is this hesitation on our own part, that, like, far be it from me, Mr. and Mrs. Customer, to tell you what to do with your money and your business. You've worked in your business for years. I haven't. So let's go back to our diagnosis. Let's go back to the reason we started down this path and use that as inspiration for which direction to go in when you get stuck. So we just don't make those recommendations. And when you look at the data, there's almost no penalty that you get from a buyer in making a firm and personal recommendation. So I'd start there. Is like, every single opportunity, every single situation, we should be making a firm and personal recommendation.
Yeah, that's a great tip. So just to close out, so in addition to that, and obviously our listeners buying the JOLT Effect and your new book, what's one other thing you could recommend to our listeners do from tomorrow onwards?
I think, again, as somebody who studies buyers and sellers, I think it's being mindful of purchasing from especially if they're spending a business's money. I'm sure you have some customers or some small business owners who are listening who sell to consumers. And we've known for a long time the consumers, like, I think I can speak for myself, perhaps you do as well, is that, when you're spending your own money, it's natural to be a little bit emotional about it. You don't want to look like an idiot to your friends. You don't want to look like, you're a bad steward of your family resources, to your spouse or to your significant other. But it turns out B2B buying, even though they're spending other people's money, they're almost as or just as emotional as a consumer is. And often we're sort of we very much assume that the business buyer is very rational, and by the way, they're probably decisive because they're senior leaders, who make decisions all day long. But when it comes to purchasing, what we find actually is a lot of indecision, and it's rooted in a lot of emotion. B2B buyers are far more emotional than you think. So we have to be mindful of that and recognize that as we work with them.
Yeah, that's great way to finish. Thanks, Ted. So look, appreciate your time. Some great insights for our listeners, and we'll reference the books in our show notes, and certainly encourage our listeners to go out and purchase a copy. So thanks again, mate.
Yeah, check us out on jolteffect.com. You'll find some other free tools on there. And for your listeners that might have interest, there's a self-paced course on there to go even deeper.
Oh, awesome. Thanks, mate.
We'd greatly appreciate you taking a couple of minutes to leave our podcast a review on iTunes. If you don't have an account, simply follow us on Spotify. You'll help other small business owners find the cast and valuable content our guests share.